All right, hey you guys, and welcome back to Taking Flight with me. My name is Mike Rocket Blackstone. Just to kind of catch you guys up, and I've just got back in from a trip flying a London trip on the Boeing 777. I'm flying that thing all over the world, and of course this Air India incident, Flight 171, has got the whole world completely baffled. And I want to take you guys into a bit of a discussion to not to rehash all of the facts that we all know, and plenty of other channels have discussed every single fact that we're at, and I'm not going to speculate too much here. However, there is, of course, plenty of things on our minds as captains of large aircraft flying all over the world. Let's just take it into a discussion on if I was the captain of, I fly the 777, so let's pretend we're on a 777-300 flying out of Victor Alpha Hotel, Victor Alpha Hotel, excuse me, that the airport in India that 171 took off from, and unfortunately had such a huge problem on takeoff. And I would just kind of go through what I'm thinking about. You know, these are the decisions that captains have to make every time we fly these airplanes in different conditions in different places in the world. If I were to go to this airport in the Triple in India on a 37 degrees centigrade day with 1001 on the millibars with light winds out of the southwest, what would I be thinking about? And what would I do? How would I handle that? And if I had a new co-pilot, and we all can understand that with 8,000 hours of total time at 55 years old, that's a pretty reasonable amount of time. However, I believe I passed the 8,000 mark somewhere over 10 years ago. I don't know whether he started later in life and was learning to fly later or spent a lot of time at the schoolhouse. I don't really know his background, and we'll find out. I guess it's not a huge question at this point, but in India, I believe the minimum flight time required for Air India, they try to get guys that have 1,000 hours or more. And the co-pilot on this particular flight seems to have 1,100 hours. So is it possible that he has only 100 hours with Air India? Or he got hired with even less than 1,000 hours in the 500 range, but legally in India, they could hire co-pilots into these aircraft, or even the wide bodies, 787s and 777 aircraft, with as little as 250 hours. As a new captain on a 787, what would you feel about having a 100-hour co-pilot with you on your first mission, or in your first year of flying the 787, let's say, and you've got a brand new co-pilot? These are the heightened sense of awareness moments that we have in flying when you get to the cockpit and you take a look at the flight time that you have with the partner that you're going to be flying with, and you compare it to what you have. You kind of decide, what your cockpit level of experience is, and then you make an assessment of risk. And as we fly these airplanes, there's always this balance of risk versus safety, right? So as you increase your flight experience in a certain type of airplane, your risk goes down and your safety goes up. As you decrease your flight time in a certain aircraft, and you're new on an aircraft, because you just switch from, say, a 737 to a 787, your risk goes up and your safety goes down as you're new. And you can't really compensate for that except just by gaining experience. So rather than go through all of the facts, we know that the 787 on flight 171 rotated very near the end of the runway, and appears to me it barely cleared the fence. Now, as you look closely at Google Earth and you zoom in on this thing, you'll see an overrun past the departure end of runway 23, past the white paint, the piano keys we call them. There's about a 220-foot piece of concrete, and then there's just dirt out to the southwest of the departure end of runway 23. As I ran some numbers using the flaps 5, which, in case any of you were wondering whether we know that flaps 5 is the appropriate flap setting for heavy and high and hot if you have an 11,500 foot runway available. If these guys chose to or weren't thinking too strongly about it and took an intersection takeoff, why would they take an intersection takeoff? And if you look at this runway diagram for Victor Alpha Hotel, the airport that they took off from, and you can imagine yourself pushing back off of the terminal near the international terminal near Lima 10, out onto Papa, and then taxiing northeastbound on Papa. You can see it kind of dead ends there, about halfway down the runway, just past the fire station on your left. You'll make the right-hand turn and hold short of this runway at Romeo 4. Now, when I go to the airport chart and look at the notes for this runway, and you go all the way down to the end, let's get to it here. It tells you how many feet are available from the different points on runway 23. So if you go to Romeo 4, and if you were to take off from there, it's got 6,181 feet. If you go down to turn pad, there's a turning pad if you kind of back taxi. So this is a single runway airport, which is kind of unusual for an international airport in my mind, because if they're taking off and landing on the same runway, you would hold short at Romeo 4, somebody would come zipping in and landing and rolling out to exit the runway down near Bravo to make the turn in towards the terminal there. And you would have to go onto the runway and back taxi. And in my airplane, in the triple, it takes about 183 feet to turn around. And this runway, if you were to look at the runway width, so let's open up the runway, 23, it's 148 feet wide. It's 11,499 feet long and 148 feet wide. Luckily, it has some turnout points along the way up to the northeast to make a turnaround so you can swing the nose gear out past the width of the runway and then have enough room to turn around. And it needs that capability for large aircraft because we need like 180 feet to turn around, and the thing's only 140 feet. So you could see how hairy that is, and you're going to need to expedite that go to the northeast to get to that turn point to turn around, because there's probably somebody coming in to land going the other direction. So this configuration of this airport is hairy at minimum and puts a lot of pressure on the crew to be expeditious on the runway, because they're going to be occupying a runway that is being used for takeoff and landing, and they need to back taxi down an active taxiway, or active runway rather, to make U-turns at these steer points. So let's go back to the chart notes and take a look at the runway lengths, and you find that first steer point down there is, the turnaround point is 9,000 feet. So let me get down to the map. 1 second here, chart. Okay, that first steer point down there is 8,999 feet. So it's 9,000 feet to that first turnaround point. And then there's another one all the way at the runway head, 11,500. So the first question in my mind is, when I'm getting my plane loaded and fueled in a place like this place here, we have a very high temperature, 37 degrees centigrade. And as you sit on the ramp and you're cooking the fuel and you're getting this thing warmed up, you're getting your fuel higher and higher temperature, and you're going to be wanting to check the fuel temperature on I have a temperature probe of what the temperature of the gas is. As we approach the 45 C range, we're approaching the maximum temperature that the fuel can get. So we typically use fuel to cool oil. We normally don't cool the fuel. And that's going to be a very possible contributing factor to this, is the high temperature and the possibility of a vapor lock. But what I'm thinking of is more likely, so these planes operate all over the world in high temperatures. The 787 has got plenty of experience at high temperatures and high altitudes, and this is its first fatal incident. I don't believe that that's a huge smoking gun theory here. I don't believe that if vapor lock is or fuel reaching its flash point or too high of a fuel temperature is not my number one threat here. What is the threat here is the high temperature, the high gross weight, and are we going to get this airplane airborne before we go off the end of the runway with two engines running? And as I ran my calculations, and if we were to be taking this flight, we'd actually have takeoff performance data from our company that's just proprietary Boeing data, which would, of course, compensate for its fuel load, its passenger load, it's the wind, the actual all of the temperature, everything baked into this thing. So you'd have your numbers pop out the other end to say, hey, what's going to be my margin at the other end? What's my climb performance going to look like at the other end with two engines operating? But what's it going to be if we lose an engine? And as I ran the data and I started to realize the very restricted minimal climb performance capability that this aircraft would have at near gross weight. I don't know what the weight was, and we'll find out what it was at some point here, but between 450 and 500,000 pounds takeoff weight as a potential guess here. These are just my thoughts as I'm looking at this thing without any numbers in front of us. If we were close to 500,000 pounds and we used the whole runway with flaps 5, with full power, if the airplane was not accelerating properly. Now, how would you know if it's accelerating properly if you don't have a lot of experience in this aircraft? The answer is you wouldn't. You don't know what you don't know. So if you've got a lot of cycles in an airplane like this, hundreds of cycles, you would start to see trends and different weights and heavyweight takeoffs. And say, by midfield, I'm normally rotating or about to rotate. I'm approaching V1 at midfield. And if you're not, and you haven't reached V1 yet, even though you haven't had an exceedance, is the acceleration adequate? Is it normal? Is it going to make it to V1 prior to reaching the end of the runway? Using 11,500 feet of runway for takeoff roll is quite extreme. This airplane should have been airborne in the 9,000 range, some 2,500 feet short of that. Now, why wouldn't it get airborne in the 9,000 foot range of available runway? The only reason I can think of is if he was beginning to have an engine failure on one side. And I'm going to guess left side. The airplane, according to some reports and some data that had been shown, is that it was veering left. So if you lost the left engine, the right engine would be pushing the aircraft towards the dead engine. So if you had two engines, you had one on the right wing and one on the left wing. If you were to have the left engine begin to spool back and start to decrease in thrust, the engine on the right would have more thrust and the airplane would begin pulling left. Follow me here? So just if the left engine were to lose thrust or not have full thrust, the airplane would begin to pull left unless the pilot compensated with right rudder. Now, once the airplane realizes that it has an engine failure, an ICAS message will pop up on our screen in the triple, and it would say engine fail if the engine was just quitting and rolling back on its own. It got to reach a certain parameter. Maybe it got too hot. Maybe something else was going wrong with it, and the left engine just rolls back. It doesn't have to catch fire to fail. However, we are in an extremely high temperature airport here, and the CHTs, the EGTs rather, not cylinder head, but the EGTs of the engines will reach an extreme number. And I've seen as high as 900 plus degrees centigrade on takeoff. 1,000 degrees centigrade is like 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. We're almost so hot you can melt rock. Lava is around 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. So that is a really, really high temperature. And putting the engine under extreme stress. So at an airport with high altitude, density altitude, in this case, because it was such a hot day, it was as if it had been around 3,000 feet, which isn't a super high altitude, but it's decreasing the performance of these motors and decreasing the capability of the lift over the wings. So as you increase your temperature, you decrease your thrust at a certain rate. And from the calculations that I looked at online and using Grok and other ways, the aircraft would have lost, by flying at a temperature of 37 centigrade or more, about 15% of its net thrust. So as this thing is accelerating down the runway, you would take your airplane from 68,000 pounds of thrust down into the 50s. And that is a significant power reduction just by the temperature. So it's as if it's doing a derated takeoff, even though it's not. It's taking off at full power. It just actually is hot. So that's going to extend its takeoff roll, decreasing its climb performance. Now, if you want to get airborne sooner, you could use a higher flap setting. So the optimal setting to get a really nice second segment climb, as somebody mentioned in my last video, yes, is flaps 5. But if you want to get airborne sooner, because you have a shorter runway, second segment climb will not matter if you don't clear the fence, right? We can all agree on that. So if he used the full 11,500 foot runway and lost an engine, now he's struggling to accelerate to V1 and VR, so takeoff decision speed. Once you're past V1, you've got to keep going or you'll go off the end at high speed. VR, rotate speed, you've got to get to VR to lift it into the air. From the video, what I see and what I saw is this airplane stayed on the ground attempting to accelerate to VR, or delayed his rotation for some reason because he was worried it wouldn't get airborne, and rotated at the very last second towards the end and got airborne, looks like in the last 500 feet of the runway. That's my opinion. We'll verify that as we start to see more data come through. When did the weight come off the wheels? Because clearly the plane got airborne, but barely. And it almost went off the end as what we would call barely clearing the fence. There is no fence from what I can see on the Google Earth. There's just an overrun area and then straight into the dirt. How low he was through that area, we don't actually have the data on it yet, but by the swirling of the dust clouds at the far end would be indicative to me he was low enough that you're seeing the wingtip vortices there right as he went over. So if there was any height, it would take a while for the plane to fly over, and then if there's any strength left in the wingtip vortices, it would kick up the dirt. You're seeing it right as he goes over it, which means the wingtip vortices were right there as it went over the departure end of runway 23. It barely cleared the fence. So that shows to me that that aircraft most likely had an engine out to some extent. Either it lost thrust, had rolled back, or it was over temping and the pilot reduced thrust to keep it in temp. I don't know. But if he's past V1, they're committed. They have to go now. And if that is in a critical area of the runway where there's not much runway left to stop, they are past V1. They've got to continue to accelerate to VR and then rotate. Whether they actually achieved VR or not, we don't know. The plane looks as if it was aggressively pulling up to avoid hitting the dirt of going off the end of the runway, which could cause more damage to the aircraft. So it went through that area so low, I believe it was airborne. I don't think that the nose wheel went into the dirt, because if it did, that may have kicked up more rocks and debris from the nose wheel and put FOD into the engines, into maybe even the good engine that's still running, in my theory of what it's looking like to me. Now, these are purely from what I see on the video, and we're just trying to evaluate what we see here. Not to put any words in anybody's mouth, but that's what it looks like from my 37 years of flying experience in small airplanes, fighter airplanes, in flying out of short field airports all over the United States, and then now flying internationally in big jets. That's what I see. Now, the next phase, once you get airborne, on a single engine. Now, the data for one engine inoperative, OEI, one engine inoperative, would require the airplane to lose an engine after V1, rotate at or beyond VR, break ground, get a positive rate, and it isn't going to be much, you guys. At 37C, this thing is going to barely get a rate of climb of a few hundred feet a minute while it's at this high of an altitude or pressure altitude and this high of a temperature. Low pressure, high temperature, high density altitude, it barely clears the fence. We get a slight positive rate. There's no more runway behind us now. We would say positive rate, maintain that deck angle, give me a slight back pressure, get me a slight angle of attack, and get the wheels up. Why the wheels did not come up is a mystery at this point. We don't know why. And there might have been additional electrical problems with this aircraft. We're going to need to get to the bottom of that. We don't know. So if you don't get positive rate and gear up, call done, and the wheels do not retract, the climb performance will be literally a couple of hundred feet per minute, as if you are in a Seneca, you're in a Baron, you're in a light twin at high altitude with one engine inoperative. If those wheels don't come up, you cannot climb. It's impossible. So you've got to get the wheels up, or you are going to be plowing straight ahead and most likely in a 2 to 3 or 4 or 500 foot per minute rate of descent straight ahead. So now we've got a very big problem on our hands. Now, did the other engine quit, or was there another mistake that was introduced here? And as I ran some probabilities through and thought processes of what could happen here, if this was my jet and I was airborne at the far end of the runway and the wheels did not come up and we call for positive rate and my brand new co-pilot reaches over and puts the handle up and nothing happens. Now what are we going to do? We don't have a procedure for that. So what is the next way to generate lift on this airplane would be to extend some more flap. You're going to land. So now you're basically, with the wheels already down, we're in the landing mode now. Although we are on takeoff, we are looking for a place to land, and we have flaps 5, which is not a very good landing flap. So in my mind, if this airplane cannot climb and we are going to descend, we need to probably get some more flaps out. That's what it looks like to me. Shortly thereafter, the captain calls his mayday call, and they've lost thrust. Why did the remaining engine quit? So now you've got the dual engine failure. We don't know, and that's where we're at. That's what we don't know here. Is this rat deployed? Did you press the button to deploy it out of just last ditch effort? You're off the procedures now anyway. The gear didn't come up. You're not climbing. Maybe they pushed it to try to give it some hydraulic pressure to try to bring the gear up using the rat. That's not really what it's designed for. That, as far as I know, with the 787, this is the first time I've ever heard of an aircraft like a 78 or a 777 being unable to bring the wheels up, because all of our climb performance is based on it. We've got to get the wheels up, or we can't climb on one engine under heavyweight, high temperature situations like what we have here in India. This is a terrible, terrible tragedy. I'm heartbroken for the 300 people that have been lost in this accident. I'm hoping that we can find a way to mitigate this risk in the future, of experience and risk. Do we use every brick on every takeoff? I looked at this airport's ADS-B data today on Flight Radar 24, and it looks to me like they use that intersection all the time. Is this a situation where you have a normalization of deviance, essentially? You're taking on more risk and leaving runway behind you as a normal procedure because we can't take the time to back taxi on every single taxi, or we're going to have a line a million miles long and it's 104 degrees Fahrenheit on the ground and we're cooking in the cockpit or cooking on the ground. You've got this temperature that is very difficult to control, the temperature in the cockpit and in the cabin. We don't have the ability to cool the airplane very well under those conditions, pretty much anywhere in the world. So that pressure to expedite, to cut around that corner, and if the engines don't fail, we're going to be fine. If one does fail, you're not going to clear the fence. That's the gamble that we're taking on every risk, and that's why they pay us the big bucks as captains of these big airplanes, to not take those risks, to evaluate my aircraft's actual mechanical capability. Do I have an MEL that's making it unsafe to fly? Even though it's okay if I have one MEL, but how about if you compound 2 or 3 MELs together? How many things can you carry on an airplane before it does become unsafe? That's our job as pilots, to verify the safety of the flight. Are the flaps 5 appropriate? Is it going to be awesome for the second segment climb? Yes, it is. But do I want to get airborne sooner because I'm a little worried about clearing the fence? Maybe I do want a flaps 15 takeoff. And maybe I do want to get airborne a little sooner. And maybe I do want to accelerate past it, but I want to get the airplane into the air. I want to make sure the wheels come up. This is the first time I've ever heard of break ground, can't get the wheels up at the far end. That's way concerning. So we've got to know. So I want to get airborne, get the wheels up, dump the nose, accelerate. And at 1,000 feet, I'm going flaps 5. Maybe it's going to burn more fuel. Maybe I'm not going to be as high as I would have been in the second segment climb, but at least I'm going to clear the fence. At least I know I'm safely airborne and accelerating, right? So those are the questions that run through my mind as a senior captain of a major airline flying the triple. But as a new captain, you may not know those things now. And if you are a new co-pilot, you definitely don't know it. That's your job as a co-pilot, is to learn from the captain. What is the smart things that you're seeing over there? What are the things that are making this safer? And what are the things that are adding risk? And our job is to minimize risk and add safety margin and be efficient while we're doing that. So I hope you've learned something from this video. I'm hoping that we get to the end of this thing pretty soon, finding out what the cockpit voice recorder says. We got to know what those guys were talking about as they taxied out, what flap settings they were talking about, what runway length that they were going to plan on using, because you do have a choice there. You can back taxi a little, you can back taxi a lot, or you can back taxi all the way to the end. Did they do that? We got to know that. So the cockpit voice recorder, absolutely critical. And the data, we want to know, did the engine quit on the runway? Did it quit prior to V1 and they continued anyway? That would be terrible head work. Did it quit right at V1 and then they experienced another problem? We don't know. They have another electrical problem. And when did the second engine quit? Or did it? Maybe the right engine is running and they just finally got so far behind the power curve that this thing couldn't fly even with one engine running. So we're not really sure right now. I listened to the video and I'm not sure whether I hear a rat or an engine running. It seems to me anybody could just take the audio right off that video and put a rat sound on it and say, there's a rat. Or isn't there? Maybe there isn't a rat. Maybe there just was a basic single engine departure that went bad. That could have totally happened too. So stick with us while we find out what happened. These are just my opinions. These are not the opinions of any airline or I'm not an employee of Boeing. I happen to fly Boeings. I think that they do an amazing job. I feel safe flying Boeings all over the world. I would fly a 787 tomorrow. I think that the plane is fine. We just need to find out what went wrong here so we can not repeat it. So you're watching Taking Flight with me. My name is Mike Rocket Blackstone. Hope you've learned something here. Be nice in the comments, you guys. We're all on the same team here. We're just trying to find where we're at and ensure that this doesn't happen again. We'll see you in the next episode. Be safe out there.